Hello, welcome to Prairie Conservation Action Plan's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Stay tuned for our next Native Prairie Speaker Series webinar. On August 22nd, Laura Griffin with Anne and Sandy Cross Conservation Area will be talking about engaging communities in nocturnal conservation, why nocturnal preserves are needed in Canada. You can register for that webinar for free through our website or in the email that will be sent to you after this presentation. Check out our website for other upcoming events. I would like to take a moment to note that in-kind support for today's webinar has been given by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. This project was undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada and the Federal Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Now, a bit about our presenters. Kylie Garchinsky grew up as a Saskatchewan farm girl. Her love of animals and nature led her to Lakeland College, Vermilion, Alberta, where she pursued an environmental sciences diploma with a major in wildlife and fisheries conservation. Kylie joined NCC as an intern in 2014 and has now taken on the position of Acting Natural Areas Manager for Southwest Saskatchewan, including Old Man on His Back Ranch near East End, Saskatchewan. She enjoys applying both her passions, ranching and conservation, to the landscapes of the Southwest. Our second presenter today is Mike Burak. Mike joined Nature Conservancy Canada in Saskatchewan as the Stewardship Coordinator in 2015. Prior to that, Mike worked in the environmental consulting industry as a wildlife biologist, overseeing pre-disturbance wildlife surveys and habitat assessments to minimize the impacts of energy development on wildlife and species at risk throughout the prairies. Mike holds a technical diploma in wildlife and fisheries conservation and a Bachelor's of Applied Science degree in environment management with a major in monitoring and environmental protection. And now I will turn it over to Kylie and Mike. Hi, Kylie and Mike. Can you hear us?
Hello. Yeah, we're just getting this up and rolling here.
Perfect.
Everything, is it showing up okay?
Yes, we can see everything.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks very much, Caitlin, and thanks to PCAP for inviting Kylie and I to give this webinar today. Hopefully we can teach everyone a bit more about the work that NCC does here in Saskatchewan and across the country. So with that, I guess we will get started. So just a quick overview of the topics we're going to discuss today. We will start with a few quick slides on who is NCC, quickly go over our mission and values, and then move on to telling everyone a bit more about what exactly it is that we do. And then finally, I will pass it off to Kylie, who will wrap up the webinar with a bit of a case study of our Old Man on His Back property in Southwest Saskatchewan. So who is NCC? Well, hopefully not too many people are asking that question. NCC was formed back in 1962 by a small group of naturalists in Toronto and has since grown to become Canada's leading national land conservation organization. So we're a private, nonprofit organization that partners with individuals, corporations, other nonprofit organizations, and all levels of government to protect our most important natural treasures, the natural areas that sustain Canada's plants and wildlife. All right, so our vision at NCC, we envision a world in which Canadians conserve nature in all its diversity and safeguard the lands and waters that sustain life. And our mission is to lead and inspire others to join us in creating a legacy for future generations by conserving important natural areas and biological diversity across all regions of Canada. So our 5 core values that we strive for in all of our work include durable conservation outcomes, so managing lands and waters for the natural values today, both today and in the long term. Evidence-based decision-making, using the best available conservation science to help guide us in our securement and stewardship work and to find practical, resourceful, and innovative solutions to conservation challenges. respect for nature and people, employing conservation solutions that meet the needs of both nature and the people within the communities that we work in. Integrity first. We work to the highest ethical and professional standards, and we are transparent and accountable to our supporters. This includes standards set out by the Land Trust Alliance and the Conservation Measures Partnership. Finally, conservation through collaboration and cooperation. We strive to be open to ideas of others and to work in the spirit of collaboration so that together we can achieve conservation outcomes that benefit all. All right. So moving on to what we do. So the three main components of NCC's conservation operations at the regional level here in Saskatchewan include conservation science and planning, securement, and stewardship. So these all feed into each other with our science and planning work here helping to inform and prioritize our securement, which then requires ongoing stewardship after they're secured for conservation. So I'll go through all those things in this order. So at NCC, our conservation process involves 4 steps, which include setting priorities, developing strategies, taking action, and measuring success. We apply this process at multiple spatial scales. So at the eco-region level, we have eco-regional assessments, or what we call conservation blueprints. Within the eco-regions, we have our natural area conservation plans, or what we call NACPs. And then at the individual property level, we have our property management plans. So here in Saskatchewan, our work is based off of the Conservation Blueprint for Canada's prairies and parklands. This includes the cypress uplands, mixed grasslands, moist mixed grassland, aspen parkland, and small parts of the boreal transition ecoregions. The blueprint prioritizes a set of areas that, if conserved, could collectively sustain the biodiversity of these ecoregions. Based off the blueprint, our regional conservation science and planning staff identify areas that present the best opportunities for NCC and our partners to make a positive impact for conservation. So these areas that we identify and ultimately choose to target our work are what we call our natural areas. So natural areas, so based off the blueprint, NCC Saskatchewan currently has 9 natural areas that we are working in across the province. So looking at the map here, north of Saskatoon and west of the city of Prince Albert, all the way to the Alberta border, we have our West Boreal Transition, which is our newest natural area that we just identified these past few months. And the West Parklands, which is right underneath that, which was formerly one of our natural areas, but it was quite a bit smaller, and we kind of broke the West Boreal Transition out of that and then expanded it a bit. South of those, surrounding the city of Saskatoon, and to the south, we have the Saskatoon Prairie Natural Area, which is bordered to the east by our Upper Capel Natural Area. East of that, from the Quill Lakes to the south to the Lower Capel Valley, is the East Parklands Natural Area. And then in the southeast, we have the Moose Mountain Natural Area. From the Big Muddy Valley northwest, near to the town of Dinsmore, we have the Missouri Coteau. And then in the southwest corner, we have the Cypress Uplands, and then along the Alberta-Montana borders east, all the way to the east block of grasslands, is the Milk River Basin. So each of these has its own natural area conservation plan specific to that area, which guides all of the work that we do within that area. NECPs are strategic plans for conservation implementation that support decision-making from the inception of the plan through the implementation period, which is normally about a 10-year span. So the plan helps NCC staff to prioritize our limited conservation resources, make sure that they are used most efficiently. The overarching goals of the plan are to identify what the desired conservation results are, and then to develop, prioritize, and implement strategies and activities that will ultimately lead to these results. They're also designed to help us track our progress as we work towards the goals that we have set for ourselves, and to adapt our strategies and activities based on what we have learned during the implementation period. So this is a bit more of a detailed zoomed-in map of the Missouri Coteau Natural Area, showing our existing properties, both fee simple properties we own, and then conservation easements, which we will talk more about in a bit. Once an NECP is written and finalized, we end up with a suite of products as the end result. So these include the identification of biodiversity targets and an assessment of the viability of these targets to determine the current state of the targets within the natural area, the identification of the threats to these targets within the natural area, as well as any knowledge gaps that we find during the process for developing the plan. We end up with a strategic plan which outlines our overarching conservation goals for the area, key intervention points for when and how NCC can play a role in achieving these goals, strategies and activities that we can implement to help achieve these goals, and the objectives that we're trying to meet through the implementation of the plan. We also develop a monitoring plan to guide us in monitoring the status of the targets and threats and the effectiveness of the strategies which we are implementing, and then of course tracking our progress throughout the 10-year implementation period. So the other main product that is produced through the development of NACP is our Conservation Prioritization Grid. So this is a GIS mapping output which classifies the entire natural area at the legal parcel level as being either priority 1, 2, 3, or non-priority. This prioritization takes into account the presence of the identified targets, threat levels, current land use and land cover, element occurrence data for COSEWIC listed species, existing protected area networks, habitat connectivity, among other things. So this grid is used to help us prioritize our conservation actions within each natural area, including our securement efforts. So you can see the red ones that show up here in the map would be priority 1, orange is 2, and then yellow is 3, and then everything that doesn't show up as one of those color and remains green is just non-priority. Moving on to securement. So as a land trust, securement is of high priority lands for conservation is a large part of what NCC does. So once an NACP is in place and the natural area has been prioritized for conservation, we now have a reference tool to help guide us when we're approached by an interested landowner wanting to work with us to protect their land. Most often it is a landowner who approaches us wanting to sell or place an easement on their land, but occasionally we also purchase land that is for sale on the open market. So NCC does two different types of securement, so fee simple securement and conservation easements. Okay, so first we'll talk about fee simple securement. So that is when NCC purchases, owns, and manages the land ourselves. So whenever we're approached with a securement opportunity, we first look to see if it fits, if the land is within one of our natural areas. And once we confirm that the land is within a natural area, we use the prioritization grid for that natural area to determine the priority ranking of the land. If we're interested and decide to pursue the purchase, then we commission an independent third-party appraisal to determine the fair market value of the property, and an offer is made to the landowner based on that determined fair market value. Landowners also have an option to donate their land to NCC and receive a taxable benefit based on the fair market value of the property. We can also combine purchase and donation in a split receipt transaction where part of the value is paid out and the remainder is receipted as a donation. So as part of the securement process, all funds are required to be in place prior to closing. In addition to the cost of the land or easement itself, we also have set aside a stewardship endowment contribution to ensure the long-term stewardship of the property. This is typically between 20 to 25% of the fair market value of the land or the easement value. This money is then added to an investment portfolio, and then we use the annual returns generated from that investment to fund the stewardship of the property over the long term. So an example of that, if we're purchasing land that's valued at $100,000, in addition to having that $100,000 on hand to cover the cost of the land and the funds to cover the staff time associated with negotiations and our project summaries that have to be prepared and approved by our national office, we also have to have an additional $20,000 to $25,000 in order for our national office to approve the purchase and ultimately release the funds. We also need to account for the funding needed to complete a baseline inventory of the property, so that would include a biological inventory, range and riparian health assessments, and a thorough cataloging of all anthropogenic features located on the property. And then the baseline inventory is what's used to develop the property management plan, which is more so part of our stewardship work that we'll talk a bit more about. So even when a landowner approaches us with the intention of donating, we still need to do an appraisal so that we can determine the value for the tax receipt, and so we know how much money needs to be set aside for the stewardship endowment contribution. So in addition, we still need to have the funding in place to cover all the costs besides the land. The other type of securement that we do is conservation easements. So those are screened in the same way as fee simple purchases for whether or not they are in a natural area and what their priority ranking is within the area. So easements are legally binding agreements between a landowner and NCC. The agreement is registered to the land title in perpetuity, which means that even if the original grantor of the easement were to sell the land at a later date, the new owner would still be bound to uphold the agreement from then on. The main purpose of the easement agreement is to outline a set of restrictions which would apply to the land with the purpose of protecting the natural features and conservation values of the property. Some of the more common restrictions that we include in our agreements are things like no subdivision, no cultivation of native rangelands, no draining of wetlands, no dumping of non-compostable garbage, and no construction of additional buildings or structures. A little stuck for a second. So while the agreement gets registered at the legal parcel level, we quite often designate and exclude areas from the restrictions where we don't want them to apply. So this is most common in the case of existing yard sites, or if there is a portion of the property that is already cultivated. We can also have separate zones within a property or a parcel where a subset of the restrictions only apply. So in the photo on the left here, you can see the landowner was concerned that the future landowners down the road who may end up purchasing it might try and subdivide out the yard site and sell it because it was located fairly close to a lake. So what we did was we zoned that out separately to be its own residential area where the only restriction that applies there is no subdivision. So the landowner is still allowed to build any new additional buildings or anything like that within that 2-acre hashed area there that shows up in orange. And the other area, which is labeled as the garden area, was set aside at the request of the landowner to allow for the future development of a large vegetable garden. So although the majority of the restrictions don't apply there either, a few which would not be contravened by the planting of a garden were still left in place. So it has a few more restrictions than the residential area actually does. So we try to work with all of our grantors at the time the agreements are drafted to plan ahead for the future, since these agreements are in perpetuity and are very hard to amend after the fact. The photo on the right is another example of one of our easements. So you can see here all the areas of tame forage have been excluded from the agreement, just so that if for whatever reason one day they decided that instead of tame grass they wanted to grow canola or wheat or whatever it was, that they'd be allowed to do that. So with our agreements on tame forage like that, it is allowed to be periodically tilled and reseeded to improve productivity. We do ask that the landowners give us a heads up, just so that we're not caught off guard when we go to visit the property during our annual monitoring. We normally try to set some deadlines to have the reseeding done in 2 or 3 years, but we're pretty flexible with that based on the environmental conditions. So, for example, if one of our landowners were supposed to reseed their tame forage back to permanent cover in a really dry year like this one, then we would have no problem with them pushing that a year or two to a wetter year where it would actually have better success. So the first thing we need to do when securing a new conservation easement is to put together a draft agreement that both NCC and the landowner are comfortable with and get it approved through our national office. It's at this stage that we try to designate any excluded areas or other zones within the property, like we kind of pointed out earlier here. Once the agreement is approved, similar to fee simple, we do a independent third-party appraisal, but these are done a little bit different in that the first we determine the fair market value of the property at its highest and best use. So not necessarily what it is right now, and then they determine the value of the property in its current state with the restrictions applied. So then the difference between those two valuations of the highest and best use and then the property with the restrictions in place becomes the value of the actual easement. So an example of that, if the value of a parcel at its highest and best use was $100,000, and then the value with the easement in place was $75,000, the value of the easement would then be $25,000. So we would NCC would either pay that out to the landowner, or they would have the option to donate all or a portion of that $25,000 and receive a tax receipt for the donated amount. So similar to fee simple purchases, in addition to the cost of the easement, we also have to have that extra 25% stewardship endowment contribution for long-term stewardship, plus the associated legal appraisal costs and funds to cover all the staff time associated with developing the agreement, negotiating with the landowner, project summaries that have to get approved as well. The last thing we do for conservation easement securement is to complete a baseline documentation report. So the purpose of the baseline documentation report is to provide a detailed snapshot of the property prior to the restrictions taking effect, so that we have a benchmark to measure against for future compliance with the agreement. The report's main purpose, in addition to providing ecological context for the property, is to catalog all of the anthropogenic features and other features located on the property. So this would include things like dugouts, sheds, fences, rock piles, dams, trails, all of that. And then we assess the condition of the property with respect to those restrictions. So an example of that is a restriction in the agreement is no construction of wildlife-proof fencing. We would document all the fencing on the property and specify whether or not they were wildlife-proof, so that we know if we go back ever and there is a new fence built and it all of a sudden is made with page wire and would impede wildlife movement, we would know that when we did the actual baseline documentation report that wasn't there based on what we have written in the report. So in that case, it would be considered a violation of the agreement. So once we finalize the agreement, the baseline documentation report, and all of the other legal reforms that are required, and of course the funding in place, we meet with the landowners and have everything signed together, and then all of the paperwork gets sent off to the lawyers to be registered to title. So stewardship. The different types of securement lead to different types of ongoing stewardship. So with fee simple lands, NCC is responsible for and leads all of the stewardship of the land, whereas with conservation easements, the landowner retains full ownership of all of the land and has full management control to continue with business as usual. So fee simple. So in Saskatchewan, NCC currently owns and manages 55 fee simple properties totaling 44,737 acres. For all of those properties, once the baseline inventories were completed, we use that document to develop a 5-year property management plan to lead our stewardship efforts. These property management plans are scaled-down versions of our NACPs and include the same types of things in them, such as identifying biodiversity targets and threats to them, outlining conservation goals for the property, effectiveness monitoring frameworks for targets and threats, as well as a list of conservation actions that we plan over a 5-year implementation period. So these actions would be things like implementing a grazing management plan, any additional fencing we needed to do, paying our property taxes every year, managing public access, which is largely hunting requests, as well as invasive species management or any hazard removal. So that would be things like wells, old farmyards, garbage piles. And then Kylie will go into a bit more detail about stewardship efforts at Old Man on His Back. So I'll just leave it there for now. So for conservation easements, we currently hold 206 conservation easements totaling 107,975 acres. So compared to fee simple stewardship, easements are very hands-off, and that is because the landowner retains full management control of the land. With our conservation easements, we visit or monitor them about once a year, and that's just to ensure that none of the restrictions have been violated and that the land is being maintained in the same condition it was at the time the agreements were signed and the baseline documentation report was written. So our annual monitoring is completed either through on-the-ground visits to the property or through aerial monitoring by fixed-wing aircraft, where we take photos using a belly-mounted camera to take a picture of the individual quarter sections that make up the property from between usually about 800 to 1,000 meters in the air. But because we can't see everything in pictures, we do have a 3-year rotating schedule where properties that are aerial monitored are also ground monitored about once every 3 years, just to make sure we're not missing anything. Once our monitoring visits are completed, we compile our findings into reports, and then we send out a post-monitoring letter to the landowner to let them know about all of our findings. So with that, I will pass things over to Kylie to talk about Old Man on His Back.
All right, so Old Man on His Back Prairie and Heritage Conservation Area, or as we call it, OMB. So as it was mentioned, I'm Kylie Garchinsky, the Acting Natural Areas Manager for Southwest Saskatchewan, and this includes managing the Old Man on His Back property, which is south of East End. And here's just a little map of OMB. Okay, so as an overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to start with the history and the purchase of the ranch. Then I will move into our property management efforts, the bison herd, our new grassbanking program that we're launching this year, and I will end off briefly discussing some of the research we have going on at OMB now. So OMB gets its name from the old man on his back plateau to the west of the ranch. This land had been owned by the Butella family for a century previous to us, maintaining almost all 13,000 acres of it as native mixed grass prairie. They cared tremendously about the environment and purposely managed this property to keep it healthy, which included lower stocking rates for cattle. Protecting the land from development and overgrazing was incredibly important to both of them, so when it came time to retire, Peter decided to contact NCC. Through a number of funding partnerships, including individuals, foundations, corporations, and the provincial government, as well as a partial land donation from Peter and Sharon, the Nature Conservancy of Canada was able to acquire the property in 1996. This 13,000 acres was a mix of fee simple property and crown lease land. And then in 2015, we had the opportunity to purchase some of the lease land. So as of then, approximately 3,700 acres is crown lease land, and the remaining 9,300 acres is fee simple. This is an exception, as NCC typically cannot hold a lease on crown land. And after purchase, NCC receded the nearly 1,000 acres of cropland back to native and tame grasses. Computer's not liking me. Okay. There we go. Okay. Old Man on His Back Ranch is NCC's first working ranch. It was a dream of Peter Butella's to see bison back on the landscape as they were hundreds of years ago, but NCC also had a goal to be a part of the community as well. So aside from the bison on approximately 9,000 acres, we run cattle on the other 4,000 acres of OMB. We have 10 patrons at OMB, which are all neighbors, and they bring their cows in to graze from June 1st to October 15th every year. This property truly is a positive example of the relationship between conservation and agriculture. So for those of you who have never been to OMB, we have an interpretive center on site. It's open from the May long weekend until mid-September, so feel free to go check it out if you're ever down in the Southwest. We had a wonderful lady named Sue DeMontel as our interpreter since day one. Unfortunately, we lost Sue in 2015, but her husband, Alan, who is our herdsman and our maintenance man, he has now taken on the title of interpreter as well. So Alan has lived in the area his whole life, and he worked for Peter before we acquired the property, so he knows more about OMB than most of us at NCC combined. We also encourage people to come out and hike around. There are no trails on the property, so wander wherever your heart desires. Just please keep a safe distance from the cows and the bison. OMB is also a great location for birders. We have species at risk, such as McCown's longspur and Sprague's pipit. Okay, so our property management plan, similar to our NECPs that Mike talked about, each property has a property management plan or a PMP. These identify biodiversity targets at an individual property scale. The biodiversity targets that we have identified for OMB are native mixed grass prairie, native silver sagebrush, wetlands and hydro riparian areas, and the plains bison. So as on all of our properties, as Mike mentioned, we annually monitor OMB, either by foot or aerial, and health assessments are done every 5 years to ensure that our property management plan is effective. The goal of our monitoring is to assess the status of our biodiversity targets. As an example, for our native mixed grass prairie target, we use range health assessments to track the condition of the various pastures of OMB. If we notice a change in the condition, we can use that to inform our grazing management plan and either increase or decrease our stocking rates. We also have an annual conservation volunteer event at OMB on the second weekend of August every year. The purpose of the CV event is to engage the public with nature, and it doubles as a work bee for us at NCC as well. So our CV events usually consist of tasks such as garbage cleanups, fence pulls, or tree planting. But at OMB, we don't have those situations. So one of our favorite tasks is fence capping. The majority of the fence at OMB is drill stem. So little birdies end up falling down and getting stuck in the posts. To say the least, we have years of fence capping to do at OMB. But there is always time for some birding and nature walk or stargazing with the members of the Royal Astronomical Society after all the grunt work is done. So you can kind of see there's a few pictures of some of our volunteers, and then there's a little girl there doing some of the fence capping. Okay, so to my favorite part of my job, the bison herd. The bison came to OMB in December of 2003 from Elk Island National Park near Edmonton. So these animals are all genetically pure plains bison. I'll jump into a quick history lesson for you all first. Around the turn of the century, fewer than 200 plains bison were left in the world. A few private citizens in Canada and the US made efforts to collect small herds in an attempt to save the plains bison from extinction. These individuals included Michael Pueblo and Charles Allard. The Pueblo Allard herd was purchased in 1907 by the Canadian government, and that's how they ended up at Elk Island National Park. Being that the Elk Island herd is genetically pure and free of brucellosis and tuberculosis, it is the foundation of many conservation herds around the world. So back to us. In 2003, the bison arrived at OMB. We received 25 heifers and 25 bulls, all 2-year-old animals. This ratio is typical of a conservation herd. The herd dynamics were a bit of a struggle for NCC during our first few roundups, so the decision was made to downsize on bulls and increase the cow population. We now sit at about 75 cows and 4 bulls, which is what you would typically see for a cow-bull ratio in a commercial beef or bison herd. We plan to increase our herd to 100 animals total, so I've been working on the logistics of that, so stay tuned. The herd runs on approximately 6,000 acres in the summer, and their winter pasture is about 3,000 acres. Our herd is pretty self-sustaining. We try to be very hands-off with them and allow them to be wild in nature. Our pasture rider does check on them, but the only time we handle them is at our annual roundup in December to wean the calves. That's what's so great about these animals. They've been on the landscape for hundreds of years and are adapted to our cold winters, hot summers, and they calve without assistance. We don't preg check the cows or semen test the bulls, and we still get about 60 calves a year. So that's an 80% birth rate, and that just supports that these animals are very well adapted and low maintenance. OMB was designated as a nocturnal preserve in 2015, so it's also a great place to come and see the stars. The Royal Astronomical Society even donated a beautiful telescope to us in Sue's name. So if you come out, you can take the telescope out and check out the stars. All right, so moving on to our grassbanking program. This is another management strategy that we're trying out this year. A grass bank is first and foremost a conservation property. In layman's terms, it is grazing exchanged for conservation benefits on ranchers' homelands. Generally, the value of the conservation benefit must equal or exceed the value of forage use. The first grass bank was the Gray Ranch in Arizona and New Mexico, which was developed to allow ranchers to rest their home pastures during times of drought. This is our first year on the ground. So we have lots to learn still, and we're trying to be really flexible and work with the patrons as much as we can. We currently have 7 of the 10 patrons at OMB tentatively signed up for 1 or more discounts, and our next step is to get out on the ground and check the things that they've been doing at home. I would like to quickly thank SODCAP, the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association, and Environment and Climate Change Canada for providing some of the funding for the initial stages of the grass bank. So here's just a little visual. I like to think of OMB as the green, and then the blue area around is the neighboring lands or the area of influence. Conservation benefits of a grass bank. We can leverage traditional protected areas to broader landscape scale conservation. It quantifies the practices which are beneficial to biodiversity, and it gives the opportunity for knowledge transfer between the patrons of NCC and NCC staff, and vice versa. The socioeconomic benefits, the Grassbank program allows us to improve economic sustainability of ranchers' home operations by giving them a discount on grazing, and it advances the relationship we have with our neighbors and create a community with conservation as a focal point. I'll just go over a few of the actions we've included as discounts for the Grassbank program. So we have species at risk presence on ranchers' property, creating new habitat, providing us with a range management plan for their home ranch, management of invasive species, replacing existing fencing with wildlife-friendly fencing, installation of remote watering systems, installation of wildlife infrastructures, and assisting at OMB. So the patrons definitely play a key role when it comes to handling the bison. So that's all I'm going to say about the Grassbank. Stay tuned as we're hoping to grow this program in the future. All right, so the last thing I will touch on today is the research we currently have going on at OMB. So we've partnered with the University of Saskatchewan and a few other organizations, and they will be doing a 3-year study on the difference in grazing patterns of bison and cattle, and in turn, the effects on species at risk. So Dale Gross is the lead of this project. He's a former NCCer. He actually hired me, so it's great to get to continue to work with him. This is a picture of Dale here collaring one of the yearling heifers at OMB this spring. So currently, the group of heifers we have there, 7 out of 30 are GPS collared, and then we have a group of cow-calf pairs where 10 out of about 45 cows are collared. And then at the roundup in December, we will be collaring about 10 of the bison cows. It's definitely a really neat project with some vegetation and birding aspects already. They were out there last week doing some drone work, and they're hoping to incorporate a bunch of other parts to the study, such as soil sampling and pollinator surveys, and then turn this into a longer project. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. So thank you for listening, and come and visit us out at OMB.
Thank you very much, Kylie and Mike, for the great presentation. I know I learned a lot. If there are any questions from the audience, from our listeners today, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. And we have a couple questions here already. So the first one is from a listener named Krista, and she was wondering if you can speak a bit more about the Grassbank, and can you describe how it works on the ground?
Okay, so I guess with the Grassbank, yes, we can talk about a few of the patrons have signed up, and I'll use as an example. A few of them have some old fencing that needs to be removed. So I'll go out there, check it out the before, so when the fence is still there, and then after they've removed X amount of miles of fence, then I'll go check it again and see how much they've removed, and then they will get X amount of dollars per mile of fence removed, and that will be discounted from their grazing fees for the year at the end when they get billed. Do you have anything for that? Okay. I hope that answers your question a little bit better.
Krista, if you have any more questions, please feel free to type that in for us. There's a question here. How did Old Man on His Back get the name?
It actually, the plateau to the west of the property it's called Old Man on His Back Plateau. So we kind of stole that for the name of the ranch.
Okay, perfect. It's kind of an unusual name.
Yeah.
The next question here, does NCC have any conservation partnerships with First Nations in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, we actually do. We have a program with Treaty for Education Alliance. It's called, we're partnering with them for their Learning the Land program. So it's a mix of incorporating Western science with traditional First Nations knowledge. So we just kind of work with the educators that are working with them and some of their consultants to kind of help incorporate the Western science part of that into the program, basically. And then we help them develop their curriculum and things like that.
Great, thank you. Krista did reply back, and she said, thanks for the Grassbank answer. That example does clarify things for me. So thanks for answering that too, Krista. For all of our listeners out there, you're welcome to type in any questions into the question section of the webinar dashboard. I would just like to remind everyone too that we have a webinar on August 22nd, and that's with Laura Griffin with Anne and Sandy Cross Conservation Area, and they'll be talking about nocturnal conservation. So tune in for that on August 22nd, and that'll be at noon. There's another question that I had actually. What would happen if there was an invasive species that came into some land that had a conservation easement on it?
More often than not, like, I mean, we don't hold the landowner accountable to control it necessarily. If we find it and we think that maybe there's a chance the landowner doesn't already know about it, then we'll usually let them know in the yearly letters that they receive. But it's not normally part of any of the restrictions, and we don't normally enforce any kind of control. It's still up to them because it is their land.
Okay, thank you, Mike. There's another question here. Are visitors allowed to access Old Man on his back by horseback or just by hiking on foot?
I think I actually just recently read that horseback is allowed. But again, the same kind of rules, I guess, would apply just to keep a safe distance from the bison herd and not to interfere with the cattle or anything like that.
Okay, yes. What's the best time of year to visit Old Man on his back?
Well, our interpretive center is open from the May long weekend until mid-September every year. Other than that, I guess in the winter, maybe you'd want to go snowshoeing, but there's not too much going on in the winter for us, aside from our bison roundup in December. So it'd be pretty quiet if you went there in the winter. So probably in the summer would be your best bet.
Okay, and so anyone can come during the winter, just the interpretive center won't be open then, but they can still access the land. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Great, that's awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have right now. Thank you very much for all of our listeners out there to tuning in today. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to contact me and I can forward it on to Mike and Kylie. And again, a huge thank you to Mike and Kylie for the great presentation today and for Nature Conservancy Canada for the ongoing support for this program. And just a reminder to check out the PCAP Facebook page for upcoming events. And this presentation has been recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube in the near future, and you can check it out there and pass the link on to anyone who was not able to make it today. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.